Hello, everyone. All right. We are going to talk about integrative behavioral couple therapy today. What is this? Our third approach that we're covering for the class. So pulled a few chapters from our readings. The first I'm going to cover is couple distress from an IBCT perspective. So, um, so today's reading and chapter on IBCTs, it's a frame for how we understand couple distress before we ever intervene. So the authors start with four big questions. The first is, what is a relationship? The second is, what is distress? The third is, what influences relationships generally? And the fourth is, what creates distress specifically? So IBCT's distinctive move is that it treats couple distress like a mysterious compatibility problem, or I'm sorry, it treats couple distress less like a mysterious compatibility problem and more like a repeatable process. So partners interact, those interactions reliably trigger emotional reactions, and those emotions drive appraisals, things like, this is unsafe, I'm unloved, they're selfish, this will never change, also known as attributions. So the aim of this chapter isn't technique yet, it's conceptual clarity. The payoff is that it sets up the deep, DEEP analysis as the IBCT way to formulate, asking questions like, what keeps this couple stuck? And why does their stuckness make sense given who they are and what they're under? So IBCT uses a behavioral interactional definition. Two people are in a relationship to the extent that they mutually influence each other through interaction. That mutual piece matters. If one person is influenced and the other isn't, for example, like following a celebrity, IBCT wouldn't call that a relationship in the same clinical sense. Then the chapter splits behavior into public and private. Public behavior is what can be observed, things like words, tones, actions, even things like blushing or perspiration if it's visible. Private behavior is internal experience, things like thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations, images, and meanings. And here's the key clinical bridge. Even though the relationship is defined through observable interaction, romantic relationships are dominated by private behavior triggered by interaction. So in IBCT, we're always tracking the loop. Interaction triggers private experience, and private experience shapes the next interaction. So IBCT defines distress very cleanly. It's a relationship where a significant portion of interaction regularly leads to either one, too much negative emotion, things like anger, resentment, or disappointment, or two, too little positive emotion, so a lack of joy, love, anticipation, or sexual attraction. The second part is clinically important because it legitimizes couples who say, we don't fight, but we're dead inside. In other words, distress isn't only about conflict, it's about the emotional flatness or chronic absence of warmth. Also, IBCT emphasizes that distress depends on appraisals. Different partners and couples have different tolerances for negativity and different expectations for positivity. So IBCT isn't asking, is this objectively bad? It's asking, how does this pattern land emotionally for each partner and what meaning do they make of it? So this is where we bring in the Kelly et al. Framework. So there's five broad categories that influence relationship functioning. Two categories are what each partner brings, so personality, social skills, history, vulnerabilities, and preferences. Two categories are context, the physical environment, things like housing, commuting, space, or illness, and social and cultural environments like in-laws, friends, gender roles, and culture. So then IBCT adds a crucial systems element. So emergent features of the relationship itself, things like the routines, the agreements, roles, inside jokes, financial agreements, things that develop between them and then start shaping future interaction. And none of this is one way. Couples can change environments, environments can change patterns, and relationship routines can reshape individual patterns over time. So that's what is meant by bidirectional. IBCT starts formulation by resisting the quote laundry list trap. Couples can come in with 27 grievances, but IBCT asks, what are the one or two central issues that organize the distress? Because often the similar fights are downstream. If the central issue is chronic loneliness or a clash about parenting, then arguments about dishes or schedules become the arena where the deeper pattern plays out. The chapter gives examples: closeness versus independence, division of labor, work-life sacrifice, parenting stress, sexual mismatch. And it keeps returning to Hank and Maria to show how central issues become a lens for everything else. So for them, it's parenting and childcare and physical intimacy. So this is the heart of the chapter here. DEEP is IBCT's acronym for the four things that maintain distress around the central issue. So differences, not deficits, differences that become problematic. The chapter makes the point that even traits we initially love can become the very traits we later resent. Differences can be personality, libido, family of origin, closeness, coping styles, interests, etc. Then there's emotional sensitivities. These are vulnerabilities shaped by temperament and learning history. Things like abandonment fears, thin skin about criticism, control sensitivities, worries about attractiveness, competence, or recognition. The chapter also highlights hard versus soft emotions. So surface anger and resentment often cover shame, rejection, and disappointment, from an EFT lens, primary and secondary emotions. External stressors, the second E. This is anything outside the dyad that intensifies the problem. Things like money strain, a commute, health, child needs. These stresses amplify differences and sensitivities. And then the P is for pattern. So what they do when they try to resolve it. Do they have a pursue, withdraw? Do they blame, defend, avoid, stonewall? Do they have an anxious pursuit and an escape? And crucially, the pattern doesn't just fail to solve the issue, it often makes the issue worse. So all of these patterns are also considered complementary roles. So a pursuer complements a withdrawer, blamer complements a defender. It's complement with an E. So IBCT is very behaviorally realistic. Dysfunctional strategies often work in the short term, which is why couples keep using them. Blame sometimes gets a temporary change. Withdrawal ends a fight. Appeasement reduces tension. Checking and investigating briefly soothes anxiety. But because the core issue remains unresolved, the cycle becomes what Rohrbaugh and Shoham call an ironic process. The attempt to solve the problem actually deepens it. This shows up as escalation, so fights intensify, polarization, where positions get more extreme, the pursuer pursues harder, the withdrawer withdraws more, and vilification, where the partner becomes defective, not different. Then it spills over into other areas and can culminate in estrangement and hopelessness. And the chapter adds a clinically important nuance. Even the repair recovery phase after conflict can become its own battleground. Partners differ in whether they want to process or move on, how quickly they recover, and what counts as repair. So, is it an apology? Is it reassurance? Is it commitment to change? If those mismatch, they can reignite conflict when, quote, trying to get back to normal. Okay, next chapter, overview and assessment. So this chapter starts by positioning IBCT in a really important way. It's principle-based rather than protocol-based. That means you don't get a manualized session 3, do X approach. Instead, you get a set of guiding principles and clinical aims that you implement depending on what the couple presents. So the structure of IBCT isn't here's the same script for every couple, it's phases with tasks. Each phase has things you must accomplish, but the pace and order can flex. The consistent spine is identify core issues, build a deep formulation, deliver that formulation collaboratively, then intervene with acceptance and change-based strategies aligned with what maintains their stuckness. IBCT is defined as four sequential phases. The first is assessment. This is where we learn the couple's presenting problems, gather the information needed to understand them, and decide whether IBCT is appropriate. This includes one conjoint session and then individual sessions. Feedback is a conjoint session where you present your deep understanding tentatively, not as a verdict, but as a shared working map. You also preview the active phase, goals and methods, so the couple can make an informed decision about whether to commit. Then there's the active intervention. So it's usually conjoint only and flexible in length. There's no fixed number of sessions. The chapter mentions the major clinical trial capped at 26 sessions, but clinically you're aiming for enough sessions to create durable change. And then there's termination. Ideally, this includes spaced sessions, then a closing session that revisits the deep analysis with attention to what shifted, what still needs monitoring, and what patterns could reemerge under stress. So assessment isn't just intake paperwork. In IBCT, assessment is already intervention in the sense that how you assess sets the tone for safety, neutrality, and hope. Goal one is rapport and early therapeutic impact. A couple often arrives skeptical, tense, embarrassed, and ambivalent. If the first session feels blaming or chaotic, they may not return. Goal two is appropriateness. IBCT is for couples in an established relationship with significant ongoing contact, where the goal is to improve the relationship or determine whether it can be saved, not to mediate a divorce already decided. And they need to be able to participate safely and coherently, not actively psychotic, not in uncontrolled addiction or acute suicidality that makes couples work unsafe, and not in dangerous levels of IPV or intimidation. Goal three is to gather the material that will become your deep analysis because feedback depends on being specific and accurate. So IBCT has a standard assessment sequence, but the chapter is clear. Clinical reality sometimes overrides the preferred structure. If a couple is in immediate crisis, like an affair just discovered and separation is imminent, you may need to stabilize first before a leisurely evaluation. If there are red flags, things like suicide or homicide risk, serious IPV, child abuse, psychosis, then you may need individual time in that very first session to make immediate referrals, do safety planning, and there's a possibility of hospitalization to consider, and sometimes a longer evaluation period. The main principle here is structure serves safety and clarity, not the other way around. So the chapter lays out 6 goals for the first conjoint session. So I'm highlighting here that this is where IBCT therapists differentiate themselves from tell me your story and I'll decide who's right, which is bad therapy. Socialization means you explicitly explain the process, the assessment over 3 sessions, questionnaires, individual meetings, then a feedback session where you offer your formulation and treatment plan. Then the couple decides whether to proceed. Then ambivalence is expected and honored. Couples often arrive reluctant, skeptical, or braced for blame. IBCT normalizes that you're not committing forever by showing up. Then rapport with both means active neutrality from this perspective. You demonstrate early that you can understand both partners without siding. Then there's core issues and deep data. It means you're already listening for differences, sensitivities, stressors, and their stuck cycle. Then therapeutic impact means validation, structure, and a first experience of being held in the room. Finally, you assign questionnaires and set expectations for independent, confidential completion if needed. So this is your slide for how to be an IBCT therapist in the room. First, You prevent long monologues by setting a structure. Give me a piece, then I'll get the other's reaction. You interrupt respectfully and to maintain balance. Second, you avoid courtroom dynamics. When a partner describes the other as controlling, you don't gather evidence like a detective. You pivot to the lived experience. So, for example, here you might say something like, "It sounds like you feel powerless and want more voice." That's the IBCT move. Empathize with the experience without agreeing to the indictment. That's the phrase, focus on the wound, not the arrow. Couples come in with arrows. Therapy works when we understand the wound beneath them. Third, you demoralize language. When clients speak in rules, things like men should initiate sex, you translate to preference and longing. You want him to initiate. Fourth, you probe vague global problems, things like no connection or communication issues, into behavioral episodes and examples because deep requires specificity. IBCT uses questionnaires strategically, not as bureaucracy, but as an efficient way to sample key domains, things like distress level, commitment, violence risk, problem areas, and existing strengths. The chapter emphasizes they prefer questionnaires that are free, easy to administer, and clinically essential. Then the individual sessions do something conjoint work often can't. They allow honest disclosure about fear and violence and commitment and affairs. IBCT's confidentiality stance is explicit. Because it's couples therapy, information is assumed shareable in joint sessions unless the client specifically respect or requests confidentiality. That structure encourages transparency while still protecting safety when needed. So this is the clinical decision-making portion of the chapter, as captured in this slide. First, IPV. The chapter is blunt. Violence is common in couples presenting to therapy, so assessment isn't optional. IBCT assesses in individual sessions because shame, fear, and loyalty dynamics distort conjoint reporting. They emphasize two focal points. Did it cause an injury, and is there fear of physical reprisal? Those are the gatekeepers for whether conjoint therapy can proceed safely. Though they stress clinical judgment, some acts are no injury but high lethality potential. Some are minor with remorse and no intimidation. Second, whoops, sorry. Oh, let's go back. Okay. Too far. Okay. All right. Second is commitment. IBCT is for couples aiming to improve the relationship, even if it's ambivalent. Not for couples who have already decided to end and want mediation. You assess whether either partner is done. They allow therapy as last step couples as long as they're both willing to try. Third is competing relationships. This is one of the chapter's longest stances, or I'm sorry, strongest stances. If there was a past affair that has ended, the therapist remains neutral about whether to disclose. You're exploring pros and cons, but not prescribing. If there is a current secret affair, IBCT takes a firm position. The client must end it, reveal it, or both, because you cannot ethically work to strengthen one relationship while a secret competing relationship is ongoing. And finally, individual history isn't just background, it directly supports deep. History informs differences, vulnerabilities, and sometimes indicates that parallel or prior treatment is needed. So, for example, uncontrolled substance use, acute suicidality, severe sexual dysfunction requiring specialty care. All right, next reading, chapter or the feedback session and treatment overview. All right, so IBCT treats the feedback session as central, not administrative. This is the moment where all the assessment data from conjoint session and individual sessions and questionnaires gets transformed into a coherent story that the couple can actually use. What makes this session different from other models is that it is explicitly less blaming than the partner's own explanations. It's more compassionate and more oriented toward change that feels possible rather than forced. It's also a consent point. By the end of the session, the couple has enough information to decide whether they want to commit to the active phase of therapy. So the feedback session has two clear parts. The first, which is longer, is the conceptualization, like understanding how distressed they are, what they struggle with, and why those struggles make sense, and what strengths remain. The second part is an orientation to treatment. So, what therapy will look like and how change happens in IBCT. Crucially, this is not a one-way presentation. IBCT explicitly frames this as a dialogue. Partners are treated as experts on their own experience, and the therapist's job is to offer a formulation that is accurate and usable, one the couple can recognize themselves in. IBCT feedback is organized around 5 questions. These questions provide a predictable, containing structure for couples who often feel overwhelmed by conflict. They also prevent therapists from jumping straight to solutions. So before what do we do, IBCT insists on clarity about where the couple is, what's at stake, and why the problem persists despite good intentions. Right. IBCT uses both clinical observation and normative data to talk about distress. Questionnaires like the CSI help couples see that their suffering is real, measurable, and shared by others who seek therapy. Sometimes this is reassuring that we're not uniquely broken. Sometimes it's sobering. This runs deeper than we thought. Either way, distress feedback is framed as information, not judgment, and it helps determine whether therapy should begin with de-escalation, safety work, or longer-term relational change. So IBCT is careful not to inflate hope falsely. If commitment is shaky or uneven, that gets named. At the same time, therapists often balance this with reflection on what the couple has built together, like children, their shared history, values, and community. This helps partners see both their discouragement and why they showed up. Importantly, IBCT does not use commitment feedback manipulatively. The goal is not to scare couples into staying, but to demonstrate deep understanding of their dilemma. IBCT pushes therapists to move beyond surface complaints like communication problems and identify core issues and often a central theme that organizes those issues. Themes are powerful because they highlight function, not fault. For example, pursuit and withdrawal may both be attempts to regulate intimacy. When therapists reduce struggle around the theme in session, change often generalizes outside session, sometimes without explicit problem solving. This is where IBCT shines conceptually. The deep analysis helps couples stop asking who's wrong and start asking why does this keep happening? The therapist introduces deep explicitly, defines it, and then applies it to the couple's lived experience. Ownership matters here. If couples have engaged with reconcilable differences and developed their own deep thinking, that material is incorporated, strengthening buy-in and collaboration. IBCT does not lead with strengths, but it does not omit them. Strengths are drawn from concrete observation and clinical reports, not platitudes. When couples can't access current positives, therapists may reflect past positives, effort, or even the willingness to seek help. The goal is not optimism, it's grounding the work in what still exists and what can be built upon. All right, the second phase of feedback answers the question, what will therapy actually look like? IBCT emphasizes that clients bring the content, things like weekly events, positives, negatives, and upcoming stressors via the weekly questionnaire. Therapists work with what emerges both on paper and in the room, especially when the couple reenacts their stuck pattern live. The 3 discussion modes map onto IBCT's dual emphasis: acceptance, so through empathic joining and a unified detachment, first, then change. The sequence matters. Deep understanding and reduced adversarial stance make change more durable and less coercive. All right, so deliberate client-led change in IBCT. All right, so this chapter starts with a paradox. Relationships are consistently changing, yet intentional change when partners try to change themselves or each other is notoriously difficult. In distressed couples, the desire for change usually shows up when partners are already emotionally activated, which makes new behavior less likely, not more. IBCT distinguishes unintentional change, things like life events, mood shifts, circumstances, from deliberate change, which is effortful, fragile, and often destabilizing if done poorly. This chapter is about how to approach deliberate change without coercion. IBCT is very clear about why deliberate change often or fails so often. Couples frequently want the other to behave differently while upset, feel emotions they don't genuinely feel, see situations as the partner sees them, or change stable personality traits. These are not easy or sometimes even possible targets for rapid change. When partners push for them anyway, they often end up in a push-pull dynamic where pressure increases resistance, and any change that does occur is short-lived or resentful. IBCT borrows conceptually from motivational interviewing and the trans-theoretical model of change. Distressed couples often arrive in a pre-contemplative stage about their own change, fully aware of the problem, but convinced the problem lies primarily with their partner. Empathic joining, unified detachment, and tolerance interventions don't just reduce conflict, they prepare the ground for change by increasing insight, empathy, and ownership. Like MI, IBCT assumes change cannot be imposed, it must be evoked. IBCT therapists assume that if a problem were simple, the couple would have already solved it. Clients often arrive with obvious solutions like be firmer, trust me, stop being so sensitive, that collapse under closer examination. Before initiating deliberate change, IBCT insists on a full, deep understanding of the issues, the differences, the sensitivities, stressors, and interactional patterns. Skipping this step often leads to elaborate negotiations that fail and reinforce hopelessness. When partners are locked in a struggle about change, pushing solutions usually makes them worse. Even therapist endorsed changes can feel coercive and provoke withdrawal, resentment, or superficial compliance. IBCT takes a strong stance here. Forced change is often worse than no change. Sometimes the outcome of IBCT work is clarity, helping partners see whether accommodation is possible or whether the relationship may not meet their needs. Even very distressed couples attempt positive change, but those efforts often fail or get punished. A partner tries to be nice and is met with suspicion. Another softens briefly and the moment passes unnoticed. IBCT therapists actively catch these moments and debrief them whether or not they worked. The goal is to reinforce effort, increase understanding of why attempts fail, and reduce the discouragement that fuels rigidity. IBCT therapists resist the urge to say, so why don't you just do that more often? Rule-governed solutions assume that insight automatically translates into action, but relational change rarely works out that way. When therapists get ahead of clients, they risk becoming the enforcer of change rather than the facilitator. IBCT emphasizes patience, trust, and supporting change that emerges organically from insight and motivation. IBCT is strategic about where change is attempted. Specific situations like an upcoming family dinner are much more workable than global goals like be less critical. IBCT also intervenes at 3 points in conflict patterns: at the early escalation, looking at this as prevention; peak escalation, here we're in harm reduction and timeouts; and recovery, where we're working on repair and reconnection. The goal is not perfection, but less damage and faster repair. Replaying difficult interactions is one of the most direct change tools in IBCT. With sufficient empathic joining and unified detachment in place, Couples are asked to reenact a stuck interaction, but do it better. The therapist is highly active, redirecting, slowing, prompting emotional disclosure, and blocking old traps. The goal is not that the couple will suddenly do this perfectly at home, but that they experience a new relational possibility, one that makes recovery easier, escalation less intense, and hope more realistic. All right, so the dyadic behavioral activation in IBCT. So this chapter starts by situating dyadic behavioral activation within IBCT's larger philosophy. IBCT does not ignore positive behavior, but it does not assume that increasing positives alone will fix distressed relationships. Empathy, understanding, and changes in how couples handle their core issues are the primary sources of connection. That said, many couples also want joy, fun, affection, and companionship. And when those are missing, the dyadic behavioral activation becomes relevant. Dyadic behavioral activation borrows from behavioral activation for depression, which helps individuals re-engage with, did I do? Okay, sorry, re-engage with reinforcing activities. With couples, activation is more complicated. Each partner behavior is shaped by and shapes the other's response. A positive act can be reinforced, ignored, or punished. IBCT therapists must manage not just the activity, but the meaning and interaction around it. Traditional and cognitive behavioral couple therapies use behavioral activation early in treatments to improve emotional climate. So, strategies include things like date nights, love days or caring days, cookie jar activities, general encouragement of joint positive behaviors. And these interventions are directive and therapist led, aimed at quickly increasing positive interactions so couples can later address deeper issues. So the wish list strategy reverses the usual dynamic of asking for change. Each partner independently generates a list of behaviors they believe would please the other without consulting them and without obligation to act yet. The recipient listens silently when the therapist helps operationalize behaviors. When implemented, givers choose what and when to act. No coercion, no negotiation, no disclosure in advance. So this strategy works because behaviors feel freely chosen rather than demanded. Even imperfect choices can be reinforcing if the effort feels genuine. Debriefing focuses on what was attempted, what was noticed, what mattered, and how costly it felt. Recipients then label behaviors as keepers, minor positives, or off the mark. Information, not prescriptions. IBCT is explicit that failure behavioral activation usually reflects timing, not motivations. Couples may be too emotionally flooded, too focused on unresolved core issues, or too mistrustful to receive positives. IBCT therapists avoid blaming couples for non-compliance and instead ask whether the intervention fit the couple at the moment. Solution-focused couple therapy uses questions, not formulations, to generate positive behavior. The miracle question elicits detailed descriptions of what would be different if problems were solved. Unlike TBCT, or like traditional therapy, traditional cognitive therapy, these behaviors often relate directly to presenting problems. IBCT can selectively borrow these questions to help couples imagine and experiment with positive change without abandoning depth. In IBCT, positive activities are always contextualized within the couple's core issues and interactional patterns. Positive behavior that reflects better handling of core issues gets the most therapeutic attention. When couples want more enjoyment and connection after acceptance work, IBCT uses behavioral activation carefully, often simply by helping couples plan doable, meaningful activities and reviewing how they went. The goal is not manufactured positivity, but sustainable connection. So I wanted to also offer this slide to you just to um, give you kind of a comparison of different like CBT approaches and how they compare to one another. So TBCT or CBCT is essentially like traditional couples therapy, or I'm sorry, what am I talking about? Traditional cognitive behavioral therapy. SFCT is solution focused couple therapy, and IBCT is integrative behavioral couple or cognitive therapy. Sorry, solution focused cognitive therapy. I keep saying couples instead of cognitive. But you can, I won't go into detail or read through this or anything. This is just for your review and your perusal to just see the differences amongst these three different approaches. All right, so communication and problem solving training. Okay, up to this point, we've talked a lot about acceptance, emotional safety, and understanding the couple's core bind. This chapter is where IBCT really diverges from what many of you may already think of as good couple therapy. Communication training and problem solving training have been foundational in behavioral and cognitive behavioral couple therapy for decades. They're also central to many prevention programs like PrEP, and they're often what couples explicitly ask for when they come to therapy. To be fair, they make intuitive sense. If couples are fighting, miscommunicating, or stuck, it seems logical to teach them better skills. But IBCT takes a more cautious stance, not because these tools are useless, but because they are often misunderstood, overused, or applied at the wrong time. So what we're going to look at is what these approaches are designed to do, where they tend to fall apart clinically, and how IBCT adapts them rather than leading with them. Communication training, sometimes called speaker listener training, is designed to slow couples down and structure their interaction. Only one person has a floor at a time, one partner speaks, the other listens. Then they switch roles deliberately. The speaker is trained to talk about their own experience, usually using some version of I feel X when you do Y in situation Z. The emphasis is on feelings, specificity, and avoiding character attacks. The listener's job is not to fix the problem, rebut the complaint, or defend themselves. Their job is to demonstrate understanding through paraphrasing, reflecting emotions, and sometimes validating the speaker's experience. Importantly, the stated goal here is understanding, not agreement. Oops, sorry, I'll go back. Oops. Wow. Okay. Where am I? Okay, that's not where we are. Here we are. Okay, sorry. The listener's job is not to fix the problem, rebut the complaint, or defend themselves. Their job is to demonstrate understanding through paraphrasing, reflecting emotions, and sometimes validating the speaker's experience. Importantly, the stated goal here is understanding, not agreement, and not problem solving. The hope is that if partners feel heard and understood, conflict will soften and resolution will become possible later. Here's where things get clinically tricky. Communication training assumes that understanding is enough, but for many distressed couples, it isn't. A partner may feel understood but still deeply hurt, or they may want the other to acknowledge harm, take responsibility, or actually change. In those moments, paraphrasing can feel hollow or even insulting. There's also the issue of emotional injury. Even perfectly edited I statements don't neutralize years of resentment, disappointment, or fear. The listener may still hear blame, criticism, or threat between the lines. And finally, for some couples, the structure itself becomes a problem. The conversation can feel stiff, artificial, or performative, especially when one partner is better at doing the skills than the other. Instead of reducing power struggles, the skills can become another arena for them. Problem solving training is different from communication training. Even though they're often paired together, problem solving training is designed for situations where the goal really is resolution or decision making. It's a very structured process. Couples are taught to adopt a collaborative mindset, define one problem clearly, brainstorm possible solutions, evaluate pros and cons, negotiate a behavioral agreement, and then revisit it after a trial period. This approach works best when the issue is behavioral and controllable, things like schedules, chores, finances, and parenting logistics. It's explicitly future oriented and action focused. In theory, PST helps couples move out of circular arguments and into practical collaboration. So PST has real limits, and IBCT is very clear about them. First, problem solving only works when both partners actually want resolution. If the goal is to be right, to vent, to punish, or to force acknowledgement, PST will fail. Second, not all problems are solvable through negotiation. Trust, desire, love, and emotional safety are not behaviors that can be scheduled or bargained for. Many of the most painful couple issues are not instrumental problems at all. Third, PST requires room for compromise. So, binary decisions like whether to have a child or take a job don't lend themselves well to brainstorming and trade offs. When PST is applied to the wrong kind of problem or at the wrong emotional moment, it often escalates conflict rather than resolving it. So this is the core IBCT position. IBCT does not assume that distressed couples lack skills. In fact, most couples communicate and problem solve just fine with coworkers, friends, or even strangers. The problem isn't that they don't know how to communicate, it's that strong negative emotion makes those skills unavailable. When partners feel unsafe, resentful, or rejected, their nervous systems are in threat mode. IBCT prioritizes creating emotional safety through empathic joining and unified detachment. Once partners feel safer and less adversarial, their natural communication abilities often reemerge without extensive skills training. Another concern is that rigid rules can become weaponized. Things like you're not using I statements or you're not listening right now. At that point, the intervention itself becomes part of the problem. So IBCT doesn't reject communication or problem-solving tools, it just uses them very differently. Rather than teaching the entire protocol, IBCT pulls specific elements when they're clinically useful. For example, asking a partner to briefly summarize something important their partner just said, or encouraging a speaker to talk more about their internal experience instead of attacking the other. IBCT therapists move fluidly. If structure helps, they use it. If emotion spikes and the couple becomes dysregulated, they drop the structure and return to acceptance work. The guiding question is always, is this helping the couple move out of their stuck pattern right now? So this is one of the more counterintuitive parts of IBCT. From a strict skills perspective, anger is often treated as something to reduce or eliminate, but IBCT looks at function, not form. Sometimes anger or confrontation actually re-engages a disengaged partner or interrupts emotional distance. It may not be elegant, but it can serve as a corrective function. IBCT therapists don't automatically label these moments as failures. Instead, they ask, did this interaction ultimately increase attention, honesty, or connection? IBCT is not trying to produce perfectly regulated conversations. It's trying to help couples find ways, sometimes messy ones, to stay connected rather than drift apart. All right, so to wrap up, communication and problem-solving skills are not bad interventions, but they are not sufficient on their own. Skills can support change, but they rarely create it. IBCT teaches us to ask when skills help and when they get in the way. Emotional safety and acceptance are what makes skills usable in the first place. As IBCT therapists, we prioritize connection over correctness. We're less interested in whether couples follow the rules perfectly and more interested in whether they're learning, repairing, and staying engaged with each other. So this chapter completes the core IBCT model. From here, the work shifts to adaptations, how IBCT flexes for different populations, contexts, and clinical challenges. And that's it.